let's begin by talking about just what soil is and what it does. And of course, it's so much more than the dirt on which we stand. As you can see around the circle of these soil ecosystem services, uh, there are many, many roles for soil. Today, we're going to be focused primarily on the carbon cycle, but there are other things that you need to keep in the back of your mind that are going on at the same time. And that simultaneous activity sometimes means that there needs to be trade-offs from one to the other. Most importantly, of course, we get our food and our fiber from the soil. It encourages biodiversity, controls water regulation and clarity, and of course, we're most interested in the role for climate change today. There's absolutely no way that we can cover everything, but we will be talking primarily about that carbon. But first, let's talk about how soils are formed. Soils are built naturally over extremely long geological time frames, literally hundreds and thousands of years. They're formed using materials that come from the mineral parent material of bedrock below them. Uh, and of course, soils contain rocks of all sizes, silt and clay. These are transformed over time by the action of microorganisms under many cycles of weather to create the soils that we know now at this particular point in the geological history. One thing I wanted to point out to you is that of critical importance is the type of vegetation growing at the surface of the soil. It's usually either grasslands or forest. These things affect the pH, the depth of the penetration of roots, and therefore, of course, the deposition of organic matter, but we'll get to that in a minute. What's soil made up of? In a general perspective, we can say that air and soil occupy approximately equal roles within the soil at 20 to 30% of the volume. Minerals take up about 45% of that volume, and organic matter, which is important when we want to talk about carbon, occupies a mere 5% of the volume of the soil. The soil is organized into layers based on the bedrock on which it sits, and then these layers are called soil horizons. They sit on top, and of course the plant material is on top of that. I wanted to introduce the term soil horizons because Canada has a well-respected taxonomic system for soils, and we're going to be talking about that as we move along. Of course, what we're most interested in is that top soil layer or horizon, because that's where soil organic matter or soil organic carbons, you can see the short form SOC, are primarily located. If we look at the layer there, we can see that the soil organic component is made up of the plant biomass, which is at the surface of the soil. It could be green and vegetative during the growing period, or at the end of the growing season, it could be dead and decaying plant biomass. You can also see that there's a very large component of roots below the surface of the soil. And it's important that whenever you look at a plant, about 50% of that plant is above ground, 50% of the plant is below ground, and that's in its fresh form. If we drive that plant down, about 50% of the plant total, whether it's above or below ground, is made up of carbon. So the majority of the carbon comes into the system as a result of the relationship between plants and the soil. There are other aspects to the organic material, including macro and microorganisms. So those are your bacteria, fungi, little insects, things like worms. There's microbial byproducts that come from the macro and microorganisms. And taken all together, they make up the soil organic matter. As you can see, the vast majority of that is related to plants, and plants derive the carbon from the process of photosynthesis, which takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converts it, when it's combined with water, uh, through the process of photosynthesis, as I mentioned, into organic carbons used for the growth and development of the plant. Okay. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the carbon which is mobile. So if we look at this little image, the whole thing is sitting on bedrock, which is often a source of carbon, but is a very stable pool. It doesn't move. On the other hand, there are some mobile pools, and they're important. So as you can see, the atmosphere is a source of carbon, which is taken up by plants. That's the section labeled biota. But those plants can also release carbon back into the atmosphere. So that's a two-way street. The biota, or the plants and the animals on the surface of the soil, when they degrade, they contribute carbon to the soils. There's a very large pool of carbon which is held in the world's oceans. And again, it's a two-way street. It gives up carbon to the atmosphere and it takes carbon out of the atmosphere. And then the other pool that's illustrated here is the pool from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are, of course, carbon made originally from plants, but it's at a geological time frame, so very, very long time ago. And fossil fuels contribute carbon to the atmosphere when they're combusted, but in this particular time frame, we're not able to say that fossil fuels are being made at this point in time. So that's just a contribution to the atmosphere. All right, we'll move on to look at what happens in the agricultural system. And when soils are converted for the use of agriculture from natural lands to arable lands, there is the introduction of atmospheric oxygen into the soil layer at the most top portion or the top horizon of the soil. And as a function of that, the soil microorganisms are able to release some of the stored carbon to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. And so the soil carbon stock is depleted and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increased. So we know that when we first convert a cropland from its native vegetation, that we watch this procedure go on that depletes the soil carbon stock and increases the atmospheric carbon. It can go on over a period of decades, centuries. It can continue for as long as the carbon continues to be released by disturbance of the soil. On a global basis, we know that since the dawn of agriculture, some 320 billion tons of carbon has been released from soil as around the world we've converted soils to the use of growing crops. We know that that is also more than has been released from fossil fuels. So it creates a tremendous gap in what once was held within soil carbon stocks and what is now held within the atmosphere. Moving along, we're going to look a little bit more at where that carbon actually comes from when the soils are disturbed. When we start to work up some soil in order to plant seeds for a crop that we want to have, we generate a really fine seed bed that's in that top soil horizon, and the carbon is lost through the respiration activity of the microbes. It releases a huge amount, as I've already said. It releases a huge amount of carbon. We've got a little video here, and the carbon goes up into the atmosphere. Soils can also act as a carbon sink as well as that carbon source. So if after that initial conversion and the process of losing the carbon to the atmosphere, we'll see that there is an equilibrium established over time so that what's taken up and what is released are in balance. We are at an equilibrium state in most of the soils in Canada, but what we are looking to do is make a change in the practice such that we'll increase the soil carbon stocks and decrease the net amount of carbon which is in the atmosphere. If we're able to do that, we should be able to have an effect on climate change because any reduction in atmospheric carbon will help with that process. Okay, let's take a look at the plants themselves. I just have to flip to my next page. So the carbon that's taken up from the atmosphere by photosynthesis is called biogenic carbon. It's different than the carbon which is released when we burn or combust fossil fuels, because that's long-standing ancient carbon. And what's different about it is that we anticipate that the carbon in the plant, after it's been taken up and used to support the growth of the upper portion of the plant and the roots, once it decays and whatever portion is released back to the atmosphere will be taken up again by the plants that grow in the next season. Unfortunately, the carbon dioxide which is released from fossil fuels has a tendency to overwhelm that system because it's more right now than what plants can take up. Let's see what actually happens when we have fresh organic material. It enters the soil by a process undertaken by the microbes that break it down into smaller pieces and that surround it with a protective layer of within the aggregates. Those little clumps that form together have lots of different characteristics depending on what type of soil it is. But overall, they improve the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil, improving things like the tilth and the water management of that soil as well. So in conclusion about soils themselves, of course, they're essential to human survival, partly because they support plant growth and partly because they have a capacity to manage carbon for us. Now let's look a little more closely at what happens with Canadian agricultural soils. As I mentioned when we were talking about how soils are made, soils are deeply impacted by the climatic zones in Canada. Our Canadian soils are mostly very cool. They tend to be cold winters that bracket a very short, warm summer, this year being no exception. And they tend to be variable in terms of the amount of moisture that they are used to. We have arid regions in the west. We have cooler, moister regions in the east, and you can see from the color variations that predominantly we have cool continental climate. Some of it is subarctic. We also have some temperate continental climates that are a little bit more humid. A lot of that area is overlain by the boreal forest, which takes up a huge amount of area in Canada. Some 270 million hectares are covered in trees in Canada. And one other interesting point that you might want to keep in the back of your mind for how we manage this is that 94% of the boreal forested region is publicly owned. Agricultural lands tend not to be publicly owned, they tend to be privately owned, and so they're independently managed. Public lands are managed more on the basis of policies that are made about them. So 270 million hectares covered in trees, obviously not appropriate for agriculture. Also, it's important to know that soils that are made underneath a forested cover tend to have a difference in pH. They have a difference in their water holding capacity, and the tilth of the soil is quite different as well. Along with that, boreal forested area, you can see that predominantly below the boreal forest we have soils that have high levels of peat and that have high levels of moisture. So wetland soils certainly have that high organic matter, high amount of carbon in the soil that we consider desirable, but they're extremely fragile and they're subject to the rapid loss of both carbon dioxide and methane if they're disturbed. And the science community around the world is overwhelmingly committed to the concept that these soils must be protected and conserved to prevent uncontrolled emissions, which would have a negative climate change impact. So the terrestrial zones that are remaining for potential agricultural production lie in two areas in Canada. They're in the west and in the eastern provinces of Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. Even here in those two areas, good pockets of soil are limited and they're constrained by the climatic conditions. So even if you have a reasonable soil, you may not have the climate, either the temperature or the moisture, which is amenable for growing crops. Soils of Canada are, we've lost my words here, they're organized under a taxonomic system which includes 10 orders, and these are listed here. But really only 3 of them make up the most of the agriculturally predominant soils. These are the Chernozem's, which you see in the olive green color over top of the prairie area. They're the Brunesols, which are covered in the blue area, and then the Gleysols, which appear purple on this map. Now, these 3 types of soils are most amenable for the production of crops, but you'll see that they lie often either under the boreal forest or they lie in climatic zones that are not very amenable to agriculture. One other thing that I wanted to point out to you is that these are relatively young soils, so they have a high degree of variability at this point in geological time, but they are generally good for agriculture. So keep that in mind as we move forward. The carbon stocks that appear in Canada, as you can see, are related mostly to those peatlands, and again, they tend not to be related to the agricultural zones. The agricultural zone is quite small. The area that we've come down to when we consider soils and consider the climatic variables is, according to 2016 data, only about 7.3% of Canada's land mass. It's a very, very small amount of area that's amenable for agricultural production. And if you look at the color variation on the map, either in the west, in the prairie region, or in the eastern provinces, you'll see that it's also the land that has the lowest amount of carbon stock in the soil. That sounds disappointing, except for the fact that if it's got relatively low carbon stock now, there is the potential to increase that carbon stock and to see a role for agriculture in carbon sequestration. It means that we're putting an awful lot of exploitation on a small area of land, however. So over time, in the history of agriculture in Canada, we've been very, very specific about the outcome from which we want to manage the soil. Initially, we started out using tillage to try and get a good seed bed. And then over time, we've had additives in the form of fertilizer or in the form of herbicide and pesticides to try and specifically increase the productivity of that land. We have sculpted the terrain for erosion control, and we have from time to time allowed land to lie fallow in order to conserve moisture. What we're talking about these days mostly is taking all of those specific needs, which are relative to an individual farm operation, and adding in, layering on top, a desire to manage specifically for carbon so that we can play this role in climate change. And the good news is we know that we can actually do it. So if we look at this map, this looks at the carbon stocks in Canada, and specifically from a period in 1971 to 2015. So if you look at that prairie area in the west, it was seriously degraded in the early 1900s because of excessive tillage, which dried the land and reduced the soil organic carbon in those soils. But in 1971, we began a process of adopting a reduced tillage technique, planting this year's seeds through last year's stubble without tilling the soil in between times. And that was adopted quite widespread over the next few years, to the point that it's certainly the business as usual now. Those reduced tillage techniques that producers adopted resulted in a complete turnaround in the amount of soil organic carbons. And you can see now that those are quite healthy, sustainable soils as a result. In the eastern part of the country, though, adoption of reduced tillage has been less successful for good reasons. And we've also seen a shift in farming away from livestock-heavy agriculture, including things like dairy, towards cash cropping. And in that part of the country, the loss of carbon continues unabated. Now, there's always a trade-off and a balance, and I know that Marie-Élise is going to speak to you more about those trade-offs. But the trade-off on the eastern side of the country versus the western side of the country is because no-till means that the soils stay a little bit moister in the spring. They don't dry out as quickly, and they don't make as rapid a nice seed bed for the germination of the next generation of crops, which is why no-till has not been so heavily adopted in the East, although there's certainly no-till around. What we're finding now after that experiment, if you will, in the West, is that the soil organic carbon, which was lost initially through intensive cropping and reached an equilibrium, when the no-till was taken up, the level of the equilibrium shifted so that there was less carbon dioxide released to the atmosphere and more retained in the soil carbon stocks. Now we're looking at a new equilibrium, and we're asking the question, what else can we do? Are there other beneficial management practices that will allow us to sequester even more carbon? And I guess the answer is yes, there is. There's more that we can do, and Marie-Élise is going to talk to you about some of those things. It's important at this point in time for you to realize that about 20% of Canadian agricultural soils are considered prime candidates for improved storage of carbon. And the adoption of beneficial management practices has given us a number that I want you to keep in mind. We've got it on the screen there for you. So we could see somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year improvement in soil organic carbons if we're able to adopt beneficial management practices that are appropriate on a farm-by-farm basis, and these will be highly variable. At the 2015 Paris Convention of the Parties climate change meetings, France initiated a global movement. This is called the 4x1000 movement, with the aspirational target of increasing annual carbon sequestration by 0.4% per year. As you can see, this target is well within the realm of possibility for Canada, and by 2030 could result in the sequestration of about 14% of the reduction target that we're at that point in time. So you can see some global modeling here which estimates the sequestration rate and shows that North America, including Canada, has one of the highest expectations for improved soil organic carbon over time. I'm going to leave you with the key messages that what we need to do is be very sure that we don't lose the carbon that was so hard won in that 1971 to 2015 period, that we need to reduce the carbon loss in the eastern provinces, and if possible to turn that around so that those soils become a sink rather than a source, and to adopt whatever beneficial management practices are on a farm-by-farm basis in order to enhance biogenic carbon. And I'm going to turn it over to Marie-Élise, and she will take you from here. Thank you.
Perfect. Merci beaucoup, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Susan.
So I'm going to talk about things starting now. I'm going to share my screen. Here you go. So now that Susan did such an incredible work to help us to better understand and appreciate the potential of carbon stock in Canadian agricultural soils, we'll talk now about the practices that can help us to get there. So, in general, we can say that in agriculture, we have three uh, things to use. The first thing is to maximize the amount of plant biomass that covers the soil in time and space. Like we saw with Susan, of course, carbon sequestration by soils goes first through photosynthesis and the plants, and there's a certain amount of plants per amount of soil that enables us to have more photosynthesis and feed more carbon, and this will go back to the soil. Of course, there's the plant biomass in the air that we see in the branches and and there's also some in the roots, and this will be sent directly to the soils. There's activity in the roots, and this is also full of carbon, and this will contribute to the increase of organic matter in the soil and therefore carbon stock in the soil. So now let's see what this means. Here again, we are in the agricultural context. Uh, to cover time and space, it can be done with different crops, for example. So here I give you, for example, a study that was made in the eastern side of Quebec. And this is a very cold and humid climate. And it's a soil with lots of clay. And here, different soils were compared uh, with a monoculture of corn, and the other one was planting a prairie with perennial plants, and you have more space and time here. And what the researchers observed at the end of 5 years is that there was less carbon in the soils, in soils that had corn and fallow land, and there wasn't at the end much difference in the carbon with corn or the other one. So on the other hand, in the treatment of perennial crops, the fodder, so we optimize the amount of biomass by a unit of soil surface, and there was a rapid increase of carbon in this soil. So there was an increase of concentration of about 20% a year. Another strategy that can be used to increase the amount of photosynthesis by unit of surface is to use coverage crops after the season of growth. And here you see the results of a study made in Ontario. It's a far lighter soil, and this soil had big crops during 7 years, and the results presented uh, are the carbon stocks after this year. You have here the control group, which was the rotation of no cover crops. And here you have a rotation of oat, RH, and rye, and here rye. And what they saw is an increase of 10 to 20 megagrams of carbon per hectare with certain cover crops after 7 years. On the other hand, we learned as well that the gain as far as carbon stock depended also of the choice of cover crop. So if you choose, for example, rye or something else, will have an effect on the amount of carbon that can be stocked in the soil. Now, we saw the first thing, which was the use of photosynthesis by a unit of surface. And the second thing is to increase the amount of organic matter that indeed goes back to the soil. And again, we're talking agricultural context. So there's a part of the biomass that will be exported by the system, since we're going to export a product that we're going to sell, the grain, for example. It's not going to go back to the soil. It will be exported for animal consumption or human consumption. On the other hand, we can also choose to bring back part of the plant biomass to the soil or to export it. So a producer can, for example, uh, to take the wheat for the animals, and another one might not need this straw and bring it back to the soil. So then we'll have stable organic matter and contribute to carbon stock long term. So concretely, once again, what does that mean? Well, in an agricultural system, we see inputs of organic matter. So there are residues of the crops that can be brought back to the soil. We can also include organic fertilizers that are crops that we will make grow on the soil with the goal of returning them fully to the soil. So this will be an organic modification that will feed the soil with organic matter. So we're bringing back the organic matter to the soil. Then we have things that are at the basis of photosynthesis and were maybe modified by other biotic or abiotic systems. We can, for example, apply a manure and also, for example, fertilizer, matter, or even biochar. So what we have to understand is that there will be lots of variability in gains, and it depends on the quantity of carbon coming back to the soil, but also its quality. And what I mean to say by that is not all carbon in the soil is equal. So here we have precisely a study made by Thompson and Christensen over 3 years. They studied the amount of carbon received, or rather retained, in the soil compared to the amount of carbon applied for manure and crop residues. And as you can see, they found that the manure, because of its biochemical quality, well, it's very different at the biochemical level, very different from crop residues. So the manure had a tendency to accumulate easier on the soil and the residues rather than the crop residues. So the quality of the input makes a big difference as far as the effect of organic matter on carbon stock in the soil long term. And the third thing to use is when we have organic matter in the soil, be it if they're there for a long time or if they're just being added, we can make this organic matter to be stabilized in the soil the longest possible, in order to avoid to a maximum the degradation, the mineralization of this organic matter, and inevitably this will create CO2. So Susan spoke about it as well uh, in an admirable way. But indeed, there's the action of microorganisms, and there's the respiration that reduces the amount of organic matter of the soils, and there's a certain proportion of CO2 that goes to the atmosphere. So the idea of this third way of doing things is to reduce losses. Uh, and this can be used And I think to use this third option is to degrade organic matter limit the degradation of organic matter in the soil. So there are mineral particles in the soil, roots, and these aggregates have to be stabilized, and it has organic matter, and it will contribute to the stabilization of organic matter in the soil. So the carbon in the soil will be stabilized long term. Now that we want till, we will change the surface of the soil. It becomes warmer, more aired. There's more contact in between organic matter and microorganisms, and for example, this affects the roots, and the organic matter is exposed to microorganisms, and the conditions are favorable for respiration. And then there's some CO2 that goes to the atmosphere, and there's a soil that's not disturbed. The organic matter will remain stabilized in the organo-mineral complexes and the aggregates, and all of this can help for the carbon to be stabilized in the soil long term. So there you go. We spoke about our way of influencing carbon stock in the soil, and now we have to bring things to the potential that is adequate. Each of the options are different. Here you have a little graph that makes a summary of the data, not only of Canada, but everywhere in the planet, where we try to compare the potential of gain as far as carbon in the soil with different practice. For example, here you have a good potential that is far lower than when we use the first uh, possibility, where we use perennial herbs or agro forest systems. So the first way of doing things, increasing plant biomass by unit of surface, has the highest potentials. Nevertheless, no matter the way we use to increase carbon in the soil, we must remember that the expected gain will necessarily vary based on the pedoclimatics conditions, but also based on the initial carbon stock in the soil. So if I have a soil that already has a lot of carbon, I have less possibilities to stock more carbon. If, on the other hand, I have a high possibility of stocking carbon, but it's very degraded, stockage will be able to be done much faster. The amount of carbon stocked in the soil depends of all the other agricultural practices that are around the practice chosen. So, for example, direct planting, will I have perennial herbs or not? Do I have, for example, any cover crops? Is it one year and not the other? And will the beneficial practices be maintained over time? So if I have perennials over 2 years and not a rotation of 10 years, I don't have the same thing as if I have a perennial herb on a permanent basis. So there you go. The fact of being able to foresee and calculate very precisely a certain way of doing things for soil carbon, it's an enormous challenge. And I think you have started to understand it. Suzanne spoke of the variability as to pedoclimatic elements at the level of the country. And with this slide, I wanted to remind you that variability is not only at the national level, but also at the level of farms and of land. All the producers know it, even sometimes part of their land, depending on topography or other items, can be different. Here you see an image of the variation of soil carbon in one single agricultural land. And in this same land, we can go to double the amount of carbon. So some lands will have more possibilities of stockage than others, and this big variability at the spatio-temporal level affects the soil. So it's very difficult to be able to measure things adequately, but also to foresee very precisely what will happen in a specific pedoclimatic situation. So the gain can be very high and the stock can be limited if you compare it to the amount of carbon. And there's a spatial-temporal variability that is enormous. So this capacity to measure this little amount is a very big challenge for science. It's a challenge that we must say is even more significant given the climate change situation. So to make calculations in a certain point in time that is fixed, that's already a challenge, but already naturally our climate is changing, and that has unavoidable consequences in plant biomass and soil regulation and on the dynamic of organic matter on natural and agricultural soils. And here you have a forecast that was published in 2015 about the estimated changes of carbon stock if we only considered climate change. Here we're not talking what humans do or territory management. We're only talking about the fact that from now until 2050, we estimate with this modeling an increase of 1 degree Celsius. And in Quebec, for example, in Quebec, there can be 2 tons of carbon per hectare that are lost every year. So there's all this uncertainty of climate change, and it complicates even more the follow-up and the management of carbon stock in the soils. And all of this is very complicated. What does that mean concretely to regulate things that we will have eventually to find a way to reduce considerably the amount of energy we need to measure the carbon stocks, and this would necessitate new technology. So we're already interested in the development of new technologies, of probes, of image analysis, proximal or satellite images, to be able through these images to estimate what the concentrations or stock of carbon are. Then we would use AI to better understand these systems, and we could understand different pedoclimatic contexts, and also with modeling we could work. No matter what, I am certain that at the level of the government, we'll have to invest to have data and better understand things. For example, we should invest on long-term research to make massive data collection, or to develop infrastructures that could enable us to analyze and to regulate all this information. And in Canada, in fact, there's still a lot of work to do in this matter. Last year, the Canadian government unfortunately withdrew a bit from the agricultural sector, and we lost a lot of tests long-term in the country. So now it's difficult to find information specific to Canada having to do with the health of soils or carbon stock in the soil. So there's lots of work still left to do in Canada. So as far as general conclusions, concerning agricultural practices for carbon sequestration, we do know that the effect of carbon stock will vary depending on the context. But we can have general ideas. At the same time, if we really want to measure or foresee real gains of carbon based on certain practices in pedoclimatic specific conditions, we'll have to work further. We'll have to develop measurement technologies. We'll have to structure the information before we get massive data. So there's enormous amounts of work to do in this sense. So now, we enter the fourth and last part of this presentation. And in this last part, Susan and I tried to do things in a global context. We spoke about carbon stock in the soil, but there's not only soil carbon that is a function in agricultural lands. So we talk frequently about the importance of soil health. What does that mean? Well, the soil health is the capacity a soil has to maintain its socio-ecological functions expected in the ecosystem where it evolves. So that means that one expects for there to be carbon sequestration. One expects also for a farmer to have reasonable performance. We also would expect the regulation to the cycle of water. We expect the well-being of the producer and good human health. So there are different functions of the soil that vary uh, and go from quantitative to society elements. They're all important. Now, the question, there's these famous BMPs, beneficial management practices. Do they really enable to improve the health of soils simultaneously and under all conditions? So to be able to answer this question, I'm going to explain to you a case study having to do with the doctoral work with the same climate on the east side of Canada, close to the city of Quebec, with a cold and humid climate, and different types of work that were applied to silty clay and also with a rotation, sandy loam, as well. So we compared a till of 25 centimeters and reduced tillage of 5 centimeters. And this marvelous research enabled us to have data on performance indicators of the soil and carbon stock over 9 years. So what did we observe as far as performance goes? These are very interesting results because here you see the difference in performance when you reduce tillage in percentages. So for silty clay, for each year in brown, you have wheat, in yellow, you have corn, and in green, you have soya. So you had at the basis certain drainage problems, but we saw that for the first years, there was little tillage and even a negative effect of tillage on the crops. But after 5 years, it would seem that differential things could be created in this very heavy soil because of microorganisms, etc. And finally, at the end of 5 years, we started to see reduced tillage affecting all the crops, wheat, corn, and soya. And we got to about 25%, and this enabled to have a financial gain of around $250 per hectare. And on the other hand, in the same farm, but with the sandy loam, there was a very different result. We observed that tillage varied enormously based on the crop. So for wheat, very little effect of tillage on performance of the wheat. A positive result for the performance of soya because there's better modulation, but with corn, systematically, there was a negative effect of tillage on performance with loss of $180 per hectare if you compare it with tillage. Now, what we must remember, and Susan spoke about it earlier, is that the season of growth is very, very short in this region. Normally, there aren't many problems with water, so we have no drought, quite the contrary, mostly in spring when the soil is warming up and drying and it's getting ready to be planted. And with the residues of crop here, there is corn from the previous season, and there can be a slowing down of warming in the spring. It can affect negatively the contact between the soil and the seed, and it can increase certain illnesses. Now, as far as indicators of soil health that were measured in those same parcels, you see the comparison between reduced tillage compared to tillage. These are results in percentages for silty clay in dark brown and sandy loam in light. And we understand that these indicators have to do with the surface of the soil. So we are in the zone of 0 to 10 centimeters. We saw 12 to 58% more of organic matter with tillage. And you can also see that it was even more marked in light soil if you compare it to heavy soil. So soils that are very sandy, because these are soils that have more difficulty to be structured naturally because they have less clay. So the effect of tillage on the parameters of health of the soil on the surface were, yeah, the effect of reduced tillage could be seen even further in this light soil. And now I'll remind you again that we spoke here of the effect of reduced tillage on the surface. On the other hand, if what we want to see is what happens on carbon stocks, we cannot only look at the surface because the great majority of carbon stock is underground. And the agricultural practices can affect the deeper carbon stocks. So these are the results. Reduced tillage in green, tillage in gray. First 15 centimeters, as I said earlier, there's an increase in organic matter on the surface with reduced tillage. 15 to 30 centimeters of depth, no difference. And starting 30 to 45 centimeters, we see the inverse tendency. And this makes for us to have more organic matter in depth with tillage than with reduced tillage. What does that mean? That with reduced tillage, there's organic matter on the surface, and with tillage, there's more underneath, and there's no effect of tillage on carbon stocks. But you say that, well, in the West, you said that we adopted a reduction of tillage and there was an increase in carbon stock, but that's because of pedoclimatic conditions that are different. So out West, we work with conditions that are far drier and warmer as well, while in Quebec, soil is very cold and humid, mostly in depth. So if there's tillage in depth, it's as if this organic matter was in the fridge. So the degradation goes slower, the degradation by microorganisms, and there's an important accumulation of organic matter in depth, which explains these results. So what can we take from this case study? That there was a variable effect on performance with reduced tillage in cold and humid climate. We're talking about a reduction of about 5% in performance if we put everything together. On the other hand, we saw a nice positive effect on the indicators of soil health on the surface, but no effect on soil carbon. If we look at everything together. Nevertheless, I don't know if you're like me, but I hear frequently that reducing tillage is proposed as a miracle solution because it will always increase the performance of soil and the health of soil. Why? Why do we hear that? And why isn't that totally right? Because it's a theory, and a theory is limited by our understanding of processes and factors that have an influence on the process. And then there's real life, where there's complexity and variability of all those systems. And to illustrate the answer to this dilemma, I am showing you here a sphere that shows three different functions that can be expected from agricultural soils. Here you have the performance of crops. Here on this axis, you have the potential of carbon stocking, and towards the higher part, the resistance to erosion. We can think about good physical traits of the soil that will help to protect the resource, and there's a resistance to erosion. So if we go back to tillage based on pedoclimatic context, I try to show here a reduction in tillage and its effect on these different functions. And so this red dot represents the context where you work with a light soil, light, dry, and there's an increase in performance when you reduce tillage. And you can also expect an increase in carbon stock in the soil and also an increase to the resistance of erosion. But the same practice, with all the other factors being equal, you take now things in a context where you are in a cold and humid climate, well, there's maybe a bit of a reduction in performance, not always though. We don't expect to stock a carbon. And on the other hand, there's a nice increase in the resistance to erosion, which is represented in the case study. So it's true for tillage, but also for all the other agricultural practices or conservation practices as well. Now, the question is which soil functions should affect the profitability of a farm. A farm is a company, an enterprise in a context where it's a free market and you have to be competitive. So, of course, if you want to be competitive, the farmer has to think about things short term, and this could affect, in certain cases, the soil, not always. On the other hand, depending on the farm and the pedoclimatic conditions, there will be an effect on resilience of agri-food in Canada, on the quality of water, on the climate, on all the other functions. If we're only interested in this function and not the others, well, we can expect that decisions will only be taken based on what is profitable for the producer, and that will have a very high cost for Canada at the end of the day. A reduction in resilience, for example, for agri-food in Canada. So the question we could ask, and I will not answer it, but this is an open question, is should we think of giving a financial value to the other functions of agricultural soil? So that's what brings me to the general conclusion. In fact, I think that, in fact, Susan and I would like you to keep the following from our presentation. There's a beautiful potential for climate solutions based on agricultural soils in Canada. Currently, we can give only very general recommendations, and there will be a variability for all the functions of the soil. So there will be variability at the level of stocking and other functions like performance or indicators of health of a soil, the quality of water, etc. So up to now, we can get general conclusions, but if we really want to maximize the performance of agricultural soils, what we propose is to invest time and money in science and technology to make deeper our knowledge, to do things on the subject, to develop measurement tools, follow-up tools, forecast tools to better understand things. And of course, we'll have to appreciate, to recognize eventually, and even quantify the value of the other functions that are different than performance short term. We also have a good idea about the practices that can be used. And as to the degree to which things are applicable, yes, the landowners have to be engaged, the farmers, the researchers, the government, the industry, but we also need involvement of government entities to be able to regulate the strategies and for the funding of research and maybe the funding of farmers to apply new strategies. And finally, to develop support tools that are based on science. So I would like to thank you enormously for listening to me today. I would also like to thank Susan for our beautiful collaboration. It really was very important for my training. It was very important for me to work on this project with Susan. And I also thank, of course, CAPI, the Canadian CAPI, for this presentation, for enabling us to make this presentation today.